today's session is the secret of efficient, fast-paced mobile growth. We're looking forward to discussing team enablement, team scaling, how does it apply to mobile with you today. For those who don't know Novoda, we're a mobile consultancy agency. We've been working in the realm of mobile for like 15 years now. And we've been particularly interested in that topic lately. We're talking about kind of how to help teams scale, how to keep teams efficient, kind of all the aspects around that. And so we're looking forward to having an open discussion with you and maybe bring some of the expertise and have interesting conversations. Today, I'm joined with Sarah, our Director of Engineering, who's going to be facilitating the discussion and the open format. So I'll let her introduce how it's going to run.
Yeah, so I shared in the chat a document. This is our document that we're going to use today. By the way, I'm sick, so my voice is scratchy and sounds really crap actually this morning. I apologize for that. So I'm going to try to speak with clarity, but it's a bit difficult today. Anyway, shared a document. We're going to do what's called a fishbowl. It's a method where a couple of experts are going to be discussing about the topic. Depending on how many people show up here, there will be either a bigger expert pool or a smaller one. And they will be talking, just having a conversation for 15 minutes. In that time, they will be the only ones with the cameras on, and everyone else will be with cameras off and microphones off, because it will be an active listening moment. In that time, you may want to already jot down questions that maybe come up, or things that you would like the people in the fishbowl, the experts in the fishbowl, to answer later. After the 15 minutes, I will pause the conversation, and we will have breakout sessions and only 5 minutes you will have, but you will have at least someone else to talk to maybe help improve your question that you add to the questions. So if you take a look at the document that I've shared, it's on the 3rd page. You have questions. We already have a couple of questions there that came from the community, just in case there's no new questions that come in. We already have some questions that the experts can talk about. After the breakouts, we're going to come back here in the main room, and the experts will continue their conversation, but this time they will be picking questions from the question pool and answering them. So having a discussion around it. Maybe they will ask something like, we need to have some clarification. And in that case, it's good to have a name in front of the question, in case, let's say, Katrina asked something and it's not quite clear what she's asking. Ben can say, hey, Katrina, can you add a little bit more context here so that you can get a better answer? So that's the reason I have the name in front. For the community questions, we don't have that option. So are there any questions about how the fishbowl is going to run today? No? Okay, so the first step is creating our fishbowl. If you feel like you would like to have an engaging conversation with Benjamin, please leave your camera on. If you feel like you want to be an observer of the conversation, please turn your camera off. Hopefully there's at least one person that's going to have their camera on with Ben. Maximum 3 people. I do see 3 people right now. Katrina, is it Andrew and Benjamin? Katrina, Andrew, and Benjamin, do you all want to be in the fishbowl? Oh, Katrina's turning her camera off. So we have Andrew and Benjamin. Does anyone else want to be in the fishbowl? Okay. So we have 2 people that are going to be in the fishbowl. Everyone else today, please keep your camera off and your microphone off. There may be some late joiners in the group. In that case, I will be asking, I will maybe interrupt the facilitation and ask them to turn off their camera and their microphone. So just to let you know. Another thing I might do as a facilitator, if I see, for example, Andrea is talking for 10 minutes without taking a breath. And Benjamin it's not an engaging conversation. I may just kind of like tickle things along and try to make sure that the conversation's going back and forth, but I'm pretty certain that you guys will do that anyway. So I'm going to keep my camera on so people see that I'm here, the facilitator of the conversation, and it's not like this weird voice coming, phantom voice coming from the background. And what we will also be doing is continually sharing the document link in the chat in case there's newcomers that they can see how the facilitation is going. So 15 minutes you have, Andre and Benjamin. Please have a nice, fun, engaging conversation around this topic. I'm going to turn off my microphone right now.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Hi, hi, Benjamin.
Hey, good to see you joining. Thanks for joining in the fishbowl. Is there any starting topic that you want to maybe touch upon, or?
Yeah, I would actually go a little bit into like just clarifying the scope. Like what are the things that we'd like to talk about today? Like what things we do touch upon and what we don't.
Yeah, so like I think it's to do with what we talked, like how to keep team efficient, how to like support your teams. So we've covered a bit like team enablement. One of the angle that we're approaching it is from like the mobile side of things. What maybe might be slightly different. How can that relate to other practices in the industry? So yeah, as long as it touches on enabling efficiency for your team, supporting your teams, I think that's good topics to have.
Okay. So let's maybe just exchange a few things we think are important about this topic. So what the first thing that comes to mind is trust. I think it's like what turns a group of people into a team. Anything you would propose?
Yeah, I think trust is definitely a big one. There's a lot that plays into, like, it's a big question, right? How to enable trust. It's particularly an interesting one. I think when we look at the context of like, if we look at the context with mobile, one of the things we have seen quite often is mentions of like, oh, our mobile teams is isolated, or they don't play well with the rest of the organization. And that type of mindset and kind of structure is already playing negatively in trust, right? Because if you have this idea of us versus them already from the beginning, like it's not a very good basis to start to build trust within the organization.
Yeah, very good point. And yeah, so a little disclaimer for the people listening to us. So I'm not a mobile developer, although I interacted a lot with mobile developers because they use our project. And my understanding is that there is a lot of isolation between Android and iOS sides as well. So it's not only mobile against non-mobile, it's also within mobile, at least two camps. Yeah, it's actually interesting. So in your experience, how do you solve these?
It can be a multitude of things. I would say one of the most common things that I've seen is a lack of trust because there's not enough understanding of where the vision is, and so not enough bringing your teams alongside with the vision of the business. So it's particularly difficult for engineers to fit within like the rest of your business if they don't know what they're working for. And like that's a lot of communication. But what tends to happen if you don't have good communication of your vision, good like explicitly getting your engineers to understand like what is it that they're working towards, what are the things that they're contributing towards, it becomes very easy for them to fall into the, well, my job is picking up a ticket, doing the ticket, marking it as done and moving on. And that's not very fulfilling, but also that's not very integrating, and it makes it easier to have this detachment from the rest of the business.
Yeah, this makes perfect sense, of course. Also, so this is one thing, like people aren't really associating themselves with the business, with the project. They only do like their job from like within the ticket mindset, right? But also I think there is this connection to the team itself, right? So one thing is involve the person into the business, and another is involve them into the team. Like have them just understand what other people care about in the team, and that would be actually very gradual work. I mean, usually if you join, you have no idea what other people need around you, and maybe they seem all like developers of the same sort, but they are actually not. They are some of them are specialists. Some of them have these kind of organic roles in the team that have been just historically filled. And all these, it's an interesting process of like ramping up someone into this social structure. Yeah, so that's another aspect, but also, as you mentioned, the disconnect of the team as a whole from the rest of the organization. I wonder, did you have any experience fixing such a thing? Like either you have an Android and iOS teams not talking to each other, or a mobile team not talking to the backend team, or whatever the other team.
Yeah, we had a couple of situations where that was the case. I mean, with regards to the disconnect, very much a case of we had it from Android and iOS, and this is a fairly common one that is actually more and more like easy to get better at, especially nowadays with even on the native side, like technologies have like converged a lot. Languages are very similar. If you look at Swift is very similar to Kotlin in paradigms in general, which makes it easier to start having cross-teams conversation, not just about feature-wise, but also architecture decisions, the patterns, and like engineering topics can be shared across. And so we've had it where basically encouraging the teams to start working, making actual decisions architecturally and engineering-wise, actually as a unit, as one team, as opposed to two separate teams. And even to the point of having cross-platform pairing and cross-platform peer reviews, which really helps cement this kind of like collaboration and unit. As with regards with the detached with the rest of the business, often it falls down to lack of trust and lack of communication. We had it happen where it was, when we talked about this kind of like disconnect, a lot was relying on the mobile team felt separate. They felt not integrated. As a result, they were getting requests from all the other teams. They were not integrated with those teams. And the rest of the organization was viewing it negatively. And it was just about breaking this cycle of blame and creating a more blame-free structure, focusing on outcomes and goals instead on like the individual communication and how it happened. And as soon as that was done, it like pretty much all the tension and all the conflict kind of like dissipated. We ended up with people focusing a little bit more on what they were trying to achieve. The engineers understood where they were fitting, and then it just kind of like really helped de-stress this situation.
Yeah, sounds really cool. So one thing you mentioned is interesting. So you're doing cross-platform reviews, right? So
yeah, like, it's a thing we've seen working. We've implemented it in a couple of our projects. We've seen it working a few times. It does require a bit more effort and a bit more will from everybody on the teams. Like it's a larger effort and emphasis, but it is a valid solution. It can work.
That sounds very interesting. So basically, you need developers on both sides to know the technology on the other side well enough to provide useful feedback, right? So did you do any like deliberate upskilling?
So to a certain degree, but that's the part where like, because the technology has converged more and more towards the same place, well, you can't have maybe the same depth of review when we're looking at more frameworky things like UI components and heavy user interaction. But for a lot of like the core part of your application, you know, you're doing API calls, saving data on a device, and then showing it on the screen. Like it's basically the same thing. And if your languages, Swift and Kotlin, are getting so similar, it doesn't require that much effort from your engineers to be able to sit down with someone on the other side and talk about how they want to decouple things. What is the structure you want to put in place? Like you're going to be able to have the exact same conversations, and you can glance at the code and understand it pretty easily. So it doesn't require that much upskilling. If you want to start having a look at framework aspects and then discussing UI and interaction, yes, it requires a bit more training. But if you've already got people to bite in, that type of training is easier, right? Like the first step is always the hardest. Once people are in, it becomes easier to start rolling in the changes.
So have you seen people just changing teams after that? Like, I've got enough competence in the other side that I would like to just, for a change, do something on that side.
Yeah, I mean, one of our engineers joined us as an iOS engineer, for example, and worked in that setup, learned Android, now is just comfortable working on either side of the platform natively with no issues whatsoever. And more recently, a second one of our engineers just did the exact same journey as well. So yeah, it's definitely possible.
Sounds pretty cool. Yeah, so I've seen the similar things in this like vertical divisions when people, for example, having a problem with something not working between the back end and the front end, just go and look into the backend code to get their front end working, and gradually get more and more competent in backend work and become full stack. So it's kind of similar. Yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's to do with like organization has a big impact on how people interact with technology. Like I think it's called Conway's law and reverse Conway's law, where the idea of like any structure kind of has an impact on the architecture that ends up being implemented, and vice versa. It's kind of similar to that. If you want your teams to collaborate more efficiently, you want to initiate more discussions. If you also want the tech to be more aligned, you want to structure your teams in a way that like you have less divide. So this idea of like trying to bring people together and trying to have thinking just outside of your own bubble and trying to bring more discussion across the board is, I think, a very crucial part of taking that step.
Yeah, I agree. Another thing I'm thinking of is this, how the attitude towards ownership and the responsibility areas affects all this. Because what I've seen working pretty well, at least in medium-sized teams, was this idea that an engineer working on a feature is responsible for this area, but anyone, if they need, can touch any sort of code. So code review will happen, and like people with more expertise in this area will provide feedback, but there is like no barriers at all. You can touch any code, and you're free to ask questions and just figure out whatever you need to make a thing work. And this, first of all, of course, it T-shapes people a lot and makes them like more competent in how the whole system works. But also it helps like this big picture building, where an engineer not only knows their own like narrow area, but they understand the project in a broader sense, and they start caring about the project in a broader sense. Because it's like, you know, there are people who like things to be in order, and they would like passing by see something is not in order here and not in order there, and I feel like refactoring today, so I'll do some tidying up here and there. And it's you know, people acquire the sense of ownership for the entire project over time. This is tremendously helpful because they acquire like common goals that, like, as a team, we have those common goals of like keeping this whole garden tidy and nice and progressing.
This is a very interesting point, because I think there's two sides to this talk about ownership. One is very much aligned with what you're stating. You want to encourage the ability for people to take ownership across the board. This idea of, you know, you can work on any part. You are responsible for it through the journey. You know, if we're looking at what DevOps means, DevOps is like ownership from inception to delivery. So really much this idea of like across the board and over it. But as you scale and as you grow as a business, I've also seen the need for more defined ownership for certain areas. And this is less about being able to work in places, but more about when something goes wrong, or when we talk about maintaining older code. This is a bit where it's very easy, as your product grows in its life cycle, as your team grows and scale, to have situations where code has been written at one point by someone in a team that needed it, then they are moving on to something else. They don't have the capacity to maintain it. Something happened, there's a bug that crops up, and now you don't know who's going to be able to fix it quickly. Like, who has the capacity to work on this right now? And that can create a lot of inefficiencies that can really slow down and cause some issues. One of the things that I've seen done that was actually quite interesting was having like an open conversation about like we need ownership, making like clear about everything that is currently present, and in a rule stating that if something doesn't have a defined owner and maintainer in the long term, it doesn't get built. It seems very drastic when you look at it that way, but actually it's quite interesting because it's like it forces people to think about what is the value of this. The value that the code that you bring should be more than just it's valuable enough that I can spend the time building it. It should be it's valuable enough that I can spend the time building it, and we're going to be maintaining it. It doesn't have to be your team maintaining it, but you need to know someone in the organization that will be able to take on and maintain it so that nothing gets unowned, nothing gets forgotten behind, and you have this more purposeful discussion about value. Is there real value in spending time and effort on this right now? Or is it just a nice to have, and actually building it might lead us to more problem in the future? Would rather focus on something else. So it's an example of where you having a defined ownership might be valuable as you grow, I guess.
Okay, okay, great conversation. So we're going to pause now. I'm going to be sending the audience to breakout sessions. You're going to have 5 minutes to talk with someone, maybe formulate some great questions. You're going to add those questions to page 3. And after the breakout, then Ben and Andre will be answering your questions. So I will see all of you back in 5 minutes. Ben and Adri, I have you also going to a breakout session. You can already discuss which questions are interesting to you as you see them popping up. So see you all in 5 minutes. Hello. We are a very small group here now. So how about we continue with the conversation? And if you have a question, you raise your hand. Also, Audrey and Ben, I see there's the community questions there. I don't see any additional questions that came from the audience. So if you feel like a question is emerging in you as Audrey and Benjamin are speaking, feel free to raise your hand, ask the question, and let's be engaging that way. So you have the floor, Audrey and Ben.
Yeah, we were having a look at the question while we have a question from Roldan.
Perfect.
Yeah, hello. I'm going to bring something that we were discussing with Richard just when the time was clicking. It's about the isolation between teams, which I think is a quite interesting point and something that I constantly see. And something that we were mentioning is like this isolation makes sense when you are talking about the backend team, the Android team, the iOS team. When you have a structure of this pool of engineers that are around, it's obvious that they are going to be isolated and there's not going to be communication because you are defining, as Ben was saying, the structure is going to be different teams. So the obvious solution usually is having these multidisciplinary squads where you have the mobile, your iOS, your Android, your backend all together. They are working together, but still, they are still not communicating. And still, we feel like, for example, Android and iOS, they are not communicating. Even, of course, you are probably going to communicate more with backend because you need to define whatever is going to be the API and whatsoever. But iOS and Android still don't talk within each other, as Andrew was mentioning. And I constantly see these people, engineer from one platform proposing something like it's some core stuff or some at observability level or some like many layers above the framework, and they keep not thinking about how the other platform is going to do it. So I don't know if you have any ideas about how to break this silo that is happening even in a team that is specifically designed to communicate between each other, and it's not happening.
Ben, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can go, but I mean, it goes to some of the things we mentioned, right? There's like practices you can put in place of like starting by having a bit more often cross-platform design decisions, cross-platform reviews. Like you start introducing it bit by bit to try and have this kind of like a bit more collaboration happening, and hope that organically you can try and like snowball that into something bigger. But it also goes a little bit on what I think Andrea was touching about earlier on, like how do you onboard people on a team? How do you kind of create this unity and this connection? And one of the things that is really important as part of that is understanding, and this comes from like you as a leader of your team, right? To facilitate that the best you can is getting a better understanding on like who the people are in your team, how do they function, what are their values, what are the things that are important to them, what are the things that are interesting to them, and then using that to encourage people to apply themselves where they have the most impact, but also like the most interest. And I guarantee you, everybody has a rich mind, and nobody is just a one-trick pony. It just might be that you haven't figured out what is the thing that makes them tick yet, or how do they interact, and you can help encourage those kind of like forte and discoveries in other aspects of your team. But first you need to really do the work to try like understand them. And then when you bring new people, if you've done already that work and effort on kind of getting to understand the values, getting to understand the needs and the wants of your team members, then bringing in new people in becomes easier, because now you're able to understand how can we fit this new person in that puzzle. The existing pieces are already understood, and then you can pair them with someone as a buddy, as like a mentor to bring them in. Find ways to get them to discover the different places with people that actually are interested and care about those. And it makes kind of that initial onboarding a little bit smoother and a little bit easier.
Great. Do you have something to add to that, Audrey?
Nothing in particular, actually. I think it's very well put. Yeah, thank you.
Nice. Are there any additional questions from the audience? Otherwise, you can also grab a question from the community.
I mean, one of the things that was interesting to us on that onboarding one, Andrea was mentioning around the idea of like, what is the impact of remote people from another country, different culture? How do you make all of that kind of fit in? So maybe you want to expand a bit on that, Andrea, and then we can have a chat about that topic.
Yes. So this is actually something I don't have a very good answer to. Like if you put it like if we take the most difficult case of a remote person in a different time zone from a different culture, with like language barrier and everything, I have no idea how to solve that. It's just very difficult, and you have to take it case by case. But there are a few things that I have experience with. One is onboarding remote people. And that, so basically, the takeaways from our experiments would be these. So A, it helps tremendously to meet in person sooner rather than later. So this is why we had in our remote team, we had like get-togethers, physical get-togethers twice a year. And that's not often enough to get everybody during their like onboarding period, but it still covers some people. It's also like if there is anybody in that location for them to meet up with in person, it helps. Also, it is very important to advertise the new person to the team, not just say, hey, this is Jane, she's going to be working with us, but also like have Jane like give a talk or work in something everybody else care about, or something else that brings the attention of other people to her and her like strong sides and her experience and all that. So that helps. It also helps to ask people their opinion on things. Like if a new person joins, you can ask them like, how do you find our processes? What do you think we could improve about the onboarding itself, how we process tickets, how we do reviews, and all these things? If the person has any experience, they will have an opinion. And it also like helps getting them more comfortable inside the team. So these are like the biggest things that come to mind. But also like any sort of social activity will be integrating, basically. Oh, we have something in the chat. Oh, the first 90-day presentation. Yeah, totally. But also, I think 90 days is a very long time. So I much prefer to have them present maybe after 30 days or something, and not on what they've been working on here, because this is kind of a report, like how well am I doing, but more of on their like previous experience, which they are more comfortable presenting about, more confident about, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and as Roland was mentioning, like Aaron Mayer's culture map, like is like really good understanding of like, it's obviously not like fast and set rules, but it is like true that like different cultures will have different ways of communicating, different ways of viewing hierarchy, and being aware of that and being able to take that into consideration when you are integrating people from different backgrounds is going to help tremendously in making it a bit easier. I also +1 on the presentation thing is something we've done for the longest of time at Novoda, I think. Whenever someone joins in, encouraging them to have a short presentation about themselves. And it's not about the tech, it's actually just about the human side. It's like getting them to talk about their hobbies and who they are and what they've done, where they've lived, just getting people to know other people as human beings and getting able to connect as someone else in their team, which makes creating this unity like a lot easier. I wanted to touch a bit on what you mentioned around the time zone aspects or like the on-site. Time zone can be tricky. I would say unless you're really getting someone that is very senior, very comfortable with working remote already, you should try and keep yourself within like +1, +2 time zone if you can. We've seen it work pretty well with like around 5 hours, 5 to 6 hours time difference, where you have at least half a day of overlap. You can still coordinate and have a fairly normal functioning. You just do your meetings on the overlap, and then you prioritize your focus time on the isolated time. If you go past that, I think it becomes very, very difficult. And then it's, at this point, it's a full organizational change. You're looking at how Mozilla functions with like full-on async, everything async, and it becomes a big challenge organizationally. So I would say probably like trying to recruit within like your 1 to 2 hour time zone difference, and then pushing it to maybe 5 if you're comfortable making some amendments. Other than that, it's going to make it a lot more difficult. If you have the ability, like one of the things that can help with remote and on-site thing, if you have, because when you hire remote, it's not uncommon to have like centers of people. Like you'll end up with people that are, overall your company is remote, but you have multiple people in similar places. We do have that. We have a few people in Barcelona. We have a few people in London, and we have a co-working space budget, like a card that people can use. So you can encourage people then to like, even if you can't meet the whole company at once, you can basically say, hey, like this week, let's just do this day at the co-working space. And everybody that is local enough can get together and have a day or a few days of working on site together. That can help kind of break the monotony of being always remote. Obviously, that doesn't work if you're really, truly, completely separated. But like I said, people in tech tend to have been centered around a few cities. So it's not unlikely that you might have a few people living in the same city. So you can encourage them to meet on site if they can.
Yeah, I wanted to emphasize one thing that you mentioned in passing. It's basically, if you have to integrate someone who's very difficult to integrate for reasons of location, culture, and everything, there's a big question like why you hired them in the first place. You probably should consider this like very carefully during the hiring process, because you're creating difficulties for yourself, for your team, and for the applicant alike. And it's going to be a tough journey. Probably like just find someone who's a better match organizationally and culturally and in every other respect.
I think we have time for another question. If you have one more question, Ben or Audrey, that stand out for you.
Let's see. Oh, Ben, you wanted to talk about the release process, right?
Yeah, so one of the things we can talk about, the release process in mobile is quite difficult, as in there's a lot more friction compared to other things, and a lot more friction usually means you need more effort. You probably need more automation or more custom automation. There's a little bit more that comes into it, because we're taking it more from like a team and enablement part of it. Like I think one of the things you raised, Andre, was like a valid one to ask, is like, how do you define who's maintaining this, who's building it? And this is the case where I've often seen that being quite difficult. Anything that has to do with supporting efficiency, building tooling, releases, automation are things that are not aligned with the KPIs of your product teams and are usually very easy to be forgotten or left behind or only dealt with when you have a bit of capacity, which, as if you've ever heard that, means never, because you never have capacity. And this is why one of the things I've seen more successful as you grow in businesses is having actually a dedicated platform team that is able to work on that horizontal level, and that is whose KPI is about empowering the other teams to go faster and is able to take on ownership of things like this without having to balance it out with your more product-focused, user-focused KPIs. So the other teams can focus on what they are good at, and then you have a team of people that are able to keep those in check, making improvements, continuously improving on it. Because that's one of the things, if you look at build, release, all of those things, it's very much, it gets worse the longer the project has been running. And it's a case of, if you're not actively working on improving it, you're not staying the same, you're getting worse. As in, like, if you're not continuously revising your build time and your automation, it's probably going to get longer and longer and longer if you do nothing about it. And so having a way to keep track of it and keep it under control becomes a vital part of like scaling and growing as a team. And yeah, I have never really seen it work when it's tried to be done embedded within the existing product teams. It needs either a dedicated team or a specific like task force of people that have that metric that they're looking at it. You need consistency, you need regularity on it to be effective, I think.
Yeah, I agree. So if you are at a point where it is your goal to improve build like speed or consistency or anything or automation, you have to dedicate some people to it. Like there's no way you're doing it somehow like in the background or anything like that. So before that happens, there's still a question of like how we improve our builds a little bit as a smaller team or as a young project or something like that. A very common approach is to just have someone like a rotating role of someone taking care of whatever happens, like exceptions and build issues and whatnot, and they would not work on features or bugs or anything but that. So if you have a good week and there is like little in terms of exceptions, you can work on the build infrastructure. But that's, a very short-term approach in terms of, you can't do a lot of things in 1 week, and people rotating will be still not sharing enough expertise and so on and so forth. So this is like a very temporary solution.
Yeah, I think it makes sense to start, like you can start that way, like having that rotation. I think one of the key part of it is very much, it shouldn't be a single person. The worst thing you can have is like being like, well, the team leader is going to do it. No, because now you're relying on one person. It's horrible. From the early on, think about like service accounts, decoupling ownership, making sure that anyone can do it. This is where automation, if you have the ability to do some automation, it forces you to do it, which is why it's good, right? It's like if the deployment to production is done by a robot instead of someone, then you can't just have one person have the credentials. The robot has the credentials and anyone can do it. So it's trying to encourage this like anyone can do it mentality. The one thing I would say is like mobile being such a pain and having things like, compile time, which isn't really a thing for web anymore. You don't really have big compiled projects. There's a few, I mean, it still exists, but like, let's say desktop software isn't really a big thing anymore, but mobile kind of functions in that way. And so you'd be surprised how quickly it becomes viable to have people dedicated to it, because I think as soon as you're like maybe 20 engineers, it probably is already worth it having some people constantly improving efficiency, because the amount of savings you're going to have multiplied by those 20 people is huge. Because when we're looking at like build time, releases and things like that, the time savings that you have for big compiled software, like mobile kind of fits in, we're talking half-hour chunks, not a couple of seconds. So it adds up really quickly. And so if you're measuring that, like you can probably make the call as a business to start investing into it earlier than you think. I would say probably like 20 people is already enough to be like, maybe we don't need to start having people constantly looking at it.
Yeah, it's another thing is whom do you hire for such positions? Like, we need somebody to work on the build and releases and everything. So what kind of skills profile is that?
It's a good challenge, isn't it? Like we've described it internally as like allist. I guess there's like, you know, the T-shaped structure, someone who's like very wide in their knowledge.
And also willing to work on non-product features, right?
Yeah. We've seen it done quite well with people that have been in product teams, that have like created the team initially, do the transition because they've realized is like, oh, this is how I can have a big impact on everyone in my team and do it. I mean, Roldan, maybe you want to give a few words, but that was your journey, isn't it? Like you started as a product engineer and has now moved as like staff engineer on the platform team.
Yeah, more or less was that. So when I joined, we were like a couple of mobile engineers, and I started taking ownership of doing the releases. So I was that guy that was doing the release every time, the same person. And eventually, of course, as the team was growing, I started to get a bit tired of that. Like, I mean, there was too many time doing this. So we started to think about automating it and having some automation and so on. And once you have the automation, then you go to what Ben was saying. You need someone maintaining it, because a product engineer doing that, then you are removing time from the business. So my role was a product engineer. I was need to create new features and added business value, not improving the build time or maintaining that. So yeah, eventually we moved into platform and create this mobile platform team to exactly taking care about all of these things. Because also it needs expertise, right? Because the rotating, I was commenting this with Sarah in the comments. The rotatory figure is interesting and it's kind of a patch, but there is a point that you need some experts in the topic, especially build times. That, I mean, Gradle can be really complicated in some parts, right? So if you have a lot of people with no much knowledge, you are not going to ever go past to a level. I mean, this is my position in general with rotatory roles. I mean, I even see this even just leading a meeting. Like we have these meetings, like we have weekly, and we try to have this person that is maintaining the meeting, and you have a big difference if the facilitator has no knowledge about how to facilitate a meeting or has some expertise. And even if some simple thing as facilitating a meeting, a rotatory figure is not always the best.
Having been a software engineer for many years, I remember when DevOps was first introduced, and I was one of those engineers that was very much against having to deploy my code. I was kind of even pissed off about it. Like, I'm a developer, I should be focusing on the functionality. This is my role, etc. However, my point of view shifted over time. Having taken on such roles and actually having done the deployments and been part of the CI/CD, etc., because what I found is I became a more responsible engineer. I started thinking about things which I didn't think about before, because now I was on the other side where it was like, what I was doing as a software engineer was a bit irresponsible, or a bit not paying attention to how it actually works in production. And so I became a much better engineer when I was forced to go out of my comfort zone and into an area which was not very comfortable for me. So I highly recommend making sure that all engineers are part of that CI/CD process, have been even on the support side of the code that they write, where they actually have to wake up in the morning and support something which they have broken, because you start coding differently, you start testing more, you start becoming a more responsible engineer. It doesn't mean doing it all the time, but definitely it improves your quality and how you are as an engineer. So we have 5 minutes left. What I would love to do is to give some time for the few people that are here left in the room to just say something. How did this roundtable go for you? Did you learn something? Do you have any new insight? Let's start with Richard.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think is what was interesting that Conway's Law came up a couple of times, that Ben mentioned it. It also came up in discussion with Roldan. Yeah, so I think one thing good points. One thing we haven't maybe come up against is that there is always a bit of you always have to make some kind of choice, and there is no perfect choice, right? That you either you can have a good, particularly when you're in a small company. I think the last few years I've been working a very big one. You have to have a choice between having a platform team and not having a platform team, having a single person responsible, rotating someone and having less expertise. So I think that's what it's made me think about more than anything else. Actually, is that there's no perfect solution to things.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard, for your for your insight and sharing with us how the roundtable was for you. Roldan, do you have something to add? How is this roundtable for you? Any new insights?
It was quite interesting. I think the conversation we have about isolation, about the teams was ringing a bell definitely to me.
Great. Thank you so much, Roldan. And how was it to be part of the fishbowl, Andre?
Oh, it was pretty interesting. I like talking in general and especially on these topics, and Ben is a great conversation partner, so thank you.
Great. Thank you for being part of the expertise in the room. And Benjamin.
Yeah, same. Like a big thank you to Andre for joining in and being a conversation partner. Those are a very interesting topic. I'm looking forward to maybe trying to have more of those conversations as we go, because there's definitely there's a need and a space for more of that to happen, and for all of us to discuss this more regularly. So I enjoyed the conversation. I really enjoyed the roundtable.
And I know whenever I've been part of the expert pool or something, I even find that just by discussing it with other experts, I'm learning too as we're talking. So it's not just a way to spread your knowledge, but also to grow the knowledge that you already have, or maybe shift a few of those paradigms in our head, or those convictions that we're stuck on. So thank you so much for coming here and joining this roundtable, and hope to see you again in one of our future roundtables. So have a lovely rest of the day.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.